She said the word nobody like it cost her nothing. Like it was a fact everyone at that table already agreed on. And the woman sitting across from her, the one laughing loudest, the one who'd been nodding along for the last 10 minutes, that woman worked for me. Had worked for me for 2 years. Reported, indirectly, through 4 layers of management, to me. And she didn't know it yet. But she was about to. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 41 years old. I own a mid-sized logistics and supply chain analytics firm headquartered on the 19th floor of a glass tower on 5th Avenue in downtown Seattle. We employ 340 people across 2 offices. Last year we did just under $61 million in revenue. And on a Friday night in April, at a dinner table in my own dining room, in my own home, my wife of 9 years looked at her 3 closest friends and told them I was nobody. I want to tell you exactly how that night went, because the details matter. Because if I skip past them, you won't understand why what happened next wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic. It was the kind of decision I make in boardrooms every week, stripped of anger, built entirely on fact. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't raise my voice for the 6 weeks that followed either. I just started pulling threads. And when you pull the right thread on the right sweater, the whole thing comes apart in your hands, and you find out what it was actually made of. But let me back up, because you need to understand who I was before that dinner, and who Elena was, and how we got to a table with 4 women laughing at a joke that had my name attached to it like a punchline. I grew up in Tacoma, in a rental house 2 blocks from a scrapyard, the kind of neighborhood where the sound of trains at 2 a.m. was just weather. My father repaired forklifts for a warehouse company for 31 years. My mother did the books for a dry cleaner. Neither of them went to college. Neither of them expected me to either, not because they didn't believe in me, but because nobody in our family had ever had the map for it. I found the map myself. Community college first, 2 years, working nights stocking shelves at a grocery distribution center. That's where I first understood supply chains. Not from a textbook, but from watching pallets move through a warehouse at 3 a.m. and noticing, even then, all the places where time and money were leaking out of the system like water through a cracked pipe. I transferred to the University of Washington on scholarships and loans I'm still faintly proud I paid off 11 years early. I got my first real job at a regional distribution company, then a second job at a firm that consulted for companies exactly like the one I'd started at. And somewhere around 29, sitting in a conference room listening to a partner explain a client's inventory problem in the most convoluted way possible, I thought, I could do this better, and I could do it for myself. I started Whitfield Logistics Group out of a spare bedroom in a rented duplex in Ballard with $14,000 in savings and a laptop I'd bought refurbished. That was 12 years ago. Nobody handed me anything. I built every square foot of what I have with my own hands and my own judgment, the same way my father rebuilt engines, patiently, methodically, without shortcuts, because shortcuts are how things break later when you're not looking. I met Elena Castellano, she'd take my name later, become Elena Whitfield, at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy nonprofit 8 years ago. I was 33. She was 30. She worked in event production at the time, coordinating exactly the kind of gala we were standing in. She had this effortless way of moving through a room, remembering names, making people feel like the most interesting person she'd spoken to all night. I found out later that was, in a sense, her job. But that night I just found it magnetic. We talked for 40 minutes by the dessert table about nothing in particular. She was from a family in Greenwich, Connecticut, old East Coast money that had thinned out by the time it reached her generation, enough of a name to open doors, not enough capital left to matter much beyond that. She'd moved to Seattle for a relationship that hadn't worked out and stayed because she liked the city better than the man. We dated for a year and a half. I fell for her the way I fall for a good acquisition, slowly at first, and then completely, once I saw the whole picture. We got married at a vineyard in Woodinville, 140 guests. Her parents flew in from Connecticut with an expression I'd later recognize as polite tolerance rather than warmth. My parents drove up from Tacoma in the Honda my father still refused to replace. My brother, Dean, gave a toast that made half the room cry, mostly because he told the truth, which is that I'd never once in my life asked anyone for anything I hadn't already decided to earn. For the first several years, things were good. Genuinely good, not performed. Elena stopped doing event production about 4 years in. I encouraged it, honestly, told her she didn't need to work if she didn't want to, that I had more than enough for both of us and whatever she wanted to build. She started volunteering more, joined boards, built a social circle of women who, over time, I noticed had a particular shape to them. Old money, or money that photographed like old money. Women whose husbands had inherited positions rather than built them, or who'd married into finance families with names on buildings. Elena started using phrases I didn't recognize as hers, talking about legacy and pedigree in ways that sounded borrowed, like clothes from someone else's closet that she'd started wearing as her own. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. In 20 years of business, I've learned that noticing and confronting are two different disciplines, and the people who conflate them usually end up reacting instead of deciding. So I watched, and I kept building the company, and I told myself that a woman is allowed to find her own social world, even if it's one that makes you feel, at the edges, like something she's slightly apologizing for. I should tell you a little more about those early years, because they matter to how deep this cut later. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Elena and I lived in a 2-bedroom condo in Belltown, before the company had grown enough to justify the house in Madison Park. Those were, in some ways, the best years. I'd come home at 9, 10 at night, exhausted from building something out of nothing, and she'd have dinner waiting, not because she felt obligated, but because, or so I believed at the time, she wanted to be part of building it with me. She used to ask me real questions about the business. Not polite questions, the kind people ask to fill a silence, but sharp ones. Why did you structure that contract with a volume discount instead of a flat rate? What happens to your margins if the client scales past their projected shipping volume? She had an instinct for it, actually, an instinct I used to tell her she should have gone into consulting herself instead of event production, and she'd laugh and say she liked building parties, not spreadsheets, but I could tell some part of her liked being asked. Somewhere around year 4, the year the company crossed $8 million in annual revenue and I signed the lease on the Fifth Avenue office, something in the texture of those conversations started to change. It was subtle enough that I didn't notice it as it was happening, the way you don't notice a slow leak in a tire until one morning it's simply flat. She stopped asking about contracts and started asking about who I'd met at industry dinners, not what we discussed, but who they were, whose family they came from, whether their names meant anything. She started describing her own friends not by what they did but by what their husbands had inherited. I remember one night, maybe 5 years in, she mentioned in passing that Caroline's husband's family had a wing of a hospital named after them, and there was something in her voice when she said it, an unmistakable note of longing, like she was describing a country she desperately wanted a passport to. I told myself, at the time, that this was normal. That everyone measures themselves against the rooms they spend the most time in, and Elena's rooms, increasingly, were rooms full of inherited money rather than built money. I told myself it didn't matter, because I knew what I'd built and she knew what I'd built, and the opinions of Caroline's husband's law partners weren't a currency I needed to spend. I was wrong about how much it mattered. I just didn't find out how wrong until much later. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Friday night in April, 6 weeks ago as I'm telling you this. Elena had invited 3 of her closest friends over, women I'd met a dozen times before at galas and dinner parties and the kind of country club lunches I mostly avoided. Caroline Ashford Reyes, married to a man who ran his family's private wealth office. Bitsy Langford, her actual name, somehow, in this century, married to a hedge fund principal. And a newer addition to the group, a woman named Priya Anand, who Elena had met, she told me, through a spin class about a year earlier. I'd shaken Priya's hand twice before that night at other gatherings, exchanged the kind of pleasantries you exchange with your wife's friends, and never once connected her to anything beyond that. Why would I have? I don't personally interview every one of the 340 people who work at Whitfield Logistics Group. I don't sit in on every department staff meetings. Priya Anand, it turned out, was a senior operations analyst in our Bellevue satellite office, 2 management layers below my COO, working on freight optimization contracts for our Pacific Northwest retail accounts. She'd been with the company 2 years. She was good at her job. I'd actually seen her name once, months earlier, on a quarterly performance report flagged for a promotion review. I hadn't put a face to the name because I don't usually need to. That's what a COO is for. I got home from the office around 6:40 that Friday, later than I'd wanted, after a call with a client in Chicago ran long. I still had my suit jacket on when I walked into the dining room, where Elena and her 3 friends were already seated with wine glasses half empty, laughter already loud enough that I could hear it from the hallway. "There he is," Elena said, not quite looking up. "Working man." I said hello to everyone, kissed Elena on the cheek, sat down at the head of the table where a plate had been left for me. Caroline asked, in the tone people use when they've already decided the answer doesn't matter, how work was going. I said it was going well, that we just closed a contract with a national retail chain that would be worth about $4 million over 3 years. There was a pause, the kind of pause that isn't interested, just polite, and then Bitsy pivoted immediately to a story about a renovation happening on her lake house. I didn't think much of it in the moment. I've sat through 100 dinners like that one, where my work is acknowledged the way you'd acknowledge weather, present, unremarkable, quickly moved past. The table had that particular candlelit glow Elena always insisted on, low light, too many candles for a Friday dinner with friends, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're auditioning for a magazine spread about tasteful living. I remember the specific dish we were eating, a saffron risotto Elena had spent most of the afternoon on, the kind of thing she used to make when we were still in the Belltown condo, back when cooking for me felt like an offering instead of an obligation. I remember thinking, even as Bitsy pivoted the conversation toward her lake house renovation, that the risotto was good, that some part of the woman I married was still in that kitchen somewhere, even if I couldn't always find her at the table anymore. Priya had been mostly quiet through that stretch of conversation, contributing the occasional polite laugh, the careful, slightly overcorrected warmth of someone newer to a friend group who hasn't yet learned exactly where the edges are. I remember she'd complimented the risotto specifically, asked Elena for the recipe, and Elena had lit up in that genuine way she still does around food, an unguarded 5 minutes before the conversation curdled into something else entirely. I want to hold on to that detail, because it's easy, telling a story like this, to make every minute of that night sound poisoned in hindsight. It wasn't. Most of it was ordinary. Most marriages that end don't end because every single moment was bad. They end because enough moments were, and because the good ones stopped being enough to outweigh them. What I didn't expect was what happened 20 minutes later, when the wine had loosened everyone considerably and the conversation drifted to some mutual friend's husband who'd just been made partner at a law firm downtown. "God, it must be nice," Caroline said, "being married to someone with an actual title. Something you can put on a save the date." Everyone laughed. Elena laughed loudest. "Marcus doesn't really have a title," she said. "I mean, he runs his own thing. It's very," she paused, searching for the word with the particular cruelty of someone who knows exactly what word she's about to land on and wants you to watch her get there. "It's very grassroots. He came from basically nothing, so honestly I think for him, just having an office with his name on the door already feels like such a huge deal." More laughter. I sat there with my fork halfway to my plate. "I mean, don't get me wrong," Elena continued, warming to it now, playing to the room in a way I recognized from every gala she'd ever coordinated, "I love that about him. It's sweet. But it's not like he's, you know," she made a small gesture with her wine glass, a little circling motion that somehow encompassed Caroline's husband's private wealth office and Bitsy's husband's hedge fund and every name on every building any of them had ever walked past. "He's kind of a nobody, professionally, compared to what you guys are used to. But it works for us." The table laughed again, that easy, comfortable laugh of people who've decided the target isn't really in the room even though he's sitting right there at the head of the table with his jacket still on. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that exact second, because the version of this story where I felt nothing, where I was simply cold and calculating from the first moment, wouldn't be true, and I promised myself I'd tell you the truth. What I felt was a kind of vertigo. 9 years of marriage. A house I'd bought outright in Madison Park. A company that employed 340 people and generated more revenue than Caroline's husband's entire wealth management book. Probably, if I'm being honest about the math, I already had half run in my head before dessert. And my wife had just called me a nobody, in my own dining room, for the entertainment of 3 women who'd never built anything in their lives beyond a seating chart. I looked around the table. And that's when I really looked, for the first time that night, at Priya Anand. She wasn't laughing as hard as the other two. She had the polite, slightly frozen smile of someone at a party who doesn't fully belong to the inside joke but doesn't want to be the one who breaks the mood either. And something about her face, I want to say I recognized her instantly, but the truth is it took me a second, maybe 2, the way it takes a second to place someone out of context, a barista you've seen at a coffee shop showing up at your gym. And then it clicked. Freight optimization. Pacific Northwest retail accounts. The performance review flagged for promotion. Bellevue office, 3rd floor, the one with the good light near the windows. Priya, I said, and the table went quiet in the particular way a table goes quiet when someone changes the register of the conversation without raising their voice. You work in operations analytics, is that right? Bellevue office? She blinked. Yes. How did you? I own the company, I said. Simply. Not dramatically. The way you'd correct a typo. Whitfield Logistics Group. You've been with us 2 years, I think. Freight optimization for the retail accounts. I watched something happen to her face that I've only seen a handful of times in my life, the specific expression of someone realizing, in real time, that the ground they're standing on isn't the ground they thought it was. She set her wine glass down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hand isn't entirely steady. She started. Marcus Whitfield. I didn't. Elena's husband is Marcus Whitfield. Since 2018, I said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I've ever sat inside. Caroline's mouth was slightly open. Bitsy had gone very still, the way people go still when they're doing rapid math about what they've said in front of whom over the last 2 hours. And Elena was staring at Priya, not at me, with an expression I can only describe as pure calculation, the look of someone trying to figure out how much damage has actually been done and whether it can still be contained. I had no idea, Priya said quietly, to me, and I believed her completely, because her whole body was communicating a kind of horror that you can't fake. I didn't know Elena was your wife. We met through spin class. She never mentioned your last name, and there's no reason I would have connected it. I'm so sorry, I didn't. You have nothing to apologize for, I said, and I meant it, and I want to be clear about that, because everything that happened after this night was never about Priya. She hadn't insulted me. She'd laughed along at a dinner party the way anyone laughs along when the hostess sets the tone, and the moment she realized who I was, her instinct was mortification, not defiance. That told me something important about her character, and it's part of why what I did next unfolded the way it did. Marcus, Elena said, finding her voice, reaching for the tone she uses when she's steering a room back to where she wants it. It was a joke. Obviously it was a joke. I don't actually think. I know exactly what you think, I said. You just told 4 people in this room what you think. I was sitting right here for it. You're being dramatic. I've heard that phrase in my life more times than I can count, always from people who have just been caught doing something they'd rather not have named out loud. I didn't argue with her. I finished my glass of water, folded my napkin, and stood up. Priya, I said, I'll see you Monday. Don't worry about tonight. I looked at the other 2 women, who suddenly seemed very interested in their plates. Caroline. Bitsy. Thank you for coming. And then I walked upstairs, into the guest room, and I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I want that on the record, because there's a version of this story where the man storms off, throws something, makes a scene that everyone gets to talk about for weeks. Marcus lost it, Marcus was so dramatic, Marcus embarrassed himself. I've built a career on understanding that the person who makes the scene is almost never the person who wins the room. So I closed the door quietly, sat down on the edge of the bed, and I did the only thing that has ever actually helped me in a moment like that. I started making a list. Not of grievances. Of facts. Fact 1, my wife had described me, to her closest friends, as a nobody, in a tone that suggested this wasn't a slip but a settled internal opinion she'd simply never said out loud in front of me before. Fact 2, an employee of mine, 2 management layers down, had been sitting in my dining room for the better part of 2 hours listening to her boss's wife describe her boss as barely worth the office he sat in. Fact 3, I had absolutely no idea, until 15 minutes ago, that my company and my marriage had ever occupied the same room without my knowledge, which meant I had no idea what else about my life existed in rooms I wasn't in. I could hear voices downstairs, Elena's, low and urgent, and then the sound of the front door opening and closing twice. Presumably Caroline and Bitsy leaving, and then a much longer, much more careful conversation between 2 people I assumed were Elena and Priya. I didn't go down to listen. I've never been a man who eavesdrops. I've always preferred information that comes to me cleanly, through the front door, rather than information stolen through a wall. So I sat with my list, and I waited, and around 10:40 I heard Elena's footsteps on the stairs. She opened the guest room door without knocking. Her makeup had smudged slightly under her eyes, though I couldn't tell if it was from crying or just the wine catching up with her. "Can we talk about this like adults?" she said. "We can talk about it," I said. "I don't know yet whether we're going to talk about it like adults or whether you're going to tell me it was a joke 4 more times." She sat down in the armchair across from the bed, the one we'd bought together at a shop in Fremont on our 2nd anniversary, and for a moment she looked genuinely lost, the way people look when the script they've been running for years suddenly doesn't have a next line. "It wasn't about you," she said finally. "Not really. It's Caroline and Bitsy, they have this whole world, and sometimes I feel like I'm always explaining you to them. Explaining us. Explaining why I'm not. Why you're not what? Why I didn't end up with someone like their husbands. Someone with a name people already know before you say it." I let that sit in the room for a second, because I wanted her to hear it back, the way you replay a recording for someone who's not sure they actually said what they said. "So for 9 years, I said, you've been sitting across tables from women whose husbands inherited law firm partnerships and hedge fund seats, and you felt the need to shrink me down to something smaller than what I actually built, because it's easier than explaining that I built it myself. That's not. That's exactly what you said at the table 20 minutes ago. You called me a nobody who came from basically nothing, and then you told them it's sweet that I have an office with my name on the door, like I'm a kid with a lemonade stand. Elena, I employ 340 people. I did $61 million in revenue last year. I have never once, in 9 years, asked your father for anything, unlike Caroline's husband, who I happen to know took over a wealth office his family had already built for him. I built mine from a spare bedroom in Ballard with $14,000 and a laptop I bought used. I know that," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I know all of that. Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough, next to what they have." "It's not supposed to feel like what they have," I said. "It's supposed to feel like what it is. Which is mine. Entirely mine. And you just told a room full of people, including someone who works for me, that it isn't worth respecting." She didn't have an answer for that. We sat in a silence that went on long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming downstairs, the specific sound of a house at night when nobody in it is speaking. I found myself, in that silence, thinking about a night almost 8 years earlier, before any of this, before Caroline and Bitsy and Priya, before the house in Madison Park even existed as anything other than a listing we used to look at online for fun, pretending we could afford it. We'd been living in the Belltown condo maybe a year, and I'd come home late from a meeting with a potential investor who'd ultimately passed on the deal, and I remember sitting on the edge of our bed feeling like the whole thing might not work, like I might spend 5 more years grinding towards something that never actually arrived. Elena had sat down next to me, still in her work clothes from the event she'd coordinated that day, and she hadn't said anything reassuring or performative. She just said, "You're going to figure it out. I've never once seen you start something you didn't finish." And I believed her completely, not because it was a nice thing to say, but because in that moment I could tell she actually believed it herself. I don't know exactly when that woman became the one standing in Bitsy's dining room talking about managing my seams. I don't think there was a single hinge moment, a day I could point to and say, this is when it changed. I think it was more like sediment, the kind of thing my father would recognize from 31 years around machines that fail slowly, one small deposit of scale at a time, until one day the part that used to move freely simply doesn't anymore, and you're left wondering how something that gradual managed to add up to something that total. "Do you remember the night before your first investor pitch?" I asked her, apropos of nothing, sitting there in the armchair across from me, in the Belltown apartment. "You told me you'd never seen me start something I didn't finish." She looked startled, like I'd reached into a part of the conversation she hadn't expected me to touch. "I remember," she said quietly. "I believed you," I said. "I've believed you about a lot of things over 9 years. I think what's actually breaking my heart tonight isn't the word nobody. It's that I don't know anymore which version of you I've been married to the whole time. The one who said that to me in Belltown, or the one who was talking about seams in Medina. Maybe both," she said, and her voice had gone very small. "Maybe I've never actually stopped being the first one, underneath. I just got tired somewhere along the way, and tired makes people say things that aren't really about the person they're saying them to. It's about them." "That might be true," I said. "But I can't build the rest of my life around waiting to find out which version shows up on a given night." "What happens now?" she finally asked. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. "But I know I'm not sleeping in that bedroom tonight. I stayed in the guest room." She went back downstairs, and I heard her moving around the kitchen for a long time, the particular restless motion of someone who wants an argument to keep going but has nobody left to have it with. I didn't sleep much either. I lay there running the same calculation I run on every acquisition that's gone sideways, the same one my father used to run under the hood of an engine that wasn't turning over. Where exactly did the failure originate, and how far back does it go? Because here's the thing I couldn't stop thinking about. It wasn't really about the word nobody. Words said in the heat of performing for friends, under wine, in a familiar dynamic, I could have let that go, chalked it up to a bad night, a woman insecure around women who'd never earned anything themselves. What I couldn't let go of was the question underneath it. How long had this been the private text of my marriage, running beneath the surface, only surfacing that night because an audience happened to loosen her tongue? How many other dinners, other galas, other lunches with Caroline and Bitsy and women whose names I didn't even know, had this same conversation happened in rooms I wasn't in? The next morning, I did what I always do when I need clarity instead of noise. I called my brother Dean. Dean is 38, runs a commercial real estate firm out of Tacoma, close enough to our childhood that he still drives past our parents' old rental house sometimes just to look at it. He's the person, aside from our father, that I trust with the parts of my life I don't hand to lawyers or accountants. "Dad called me an hour ago," he said when he picked up. "Said you sounded strange on the phone last night." I hadn't remembered calling our father, but apparently I had, around midnight, in the fog of the guest room, some half-formed conversation I only vaguely recalled. I told Dean everything, the dinner, the word, Priya, the silence afterward. He was quiet for a while. Dean doesn't rush to fill silence, which is one of the reasons I trust him. "Do you love her?" he asked eventually. "I don't know anymore what that word means to her," I said. "I know what it's meant to me for 9 years. I don't think it's meant the same thing to her for a while." "What do you want to do?" "I want to find out how deep this goes before I decide anything," I said. "I'm not going to blow up a marriage over one bad night at a dinner table. But I also don't believe it was one bad night." I think it was the first night I happened to be in the room to hear it. That sounds right to me, Dean said. Dad used to say the crack you can see is never the only crack. You want me to come up? Not yet, I said. But I might need you later. I did drive down to Tacoma that Sunday, though, to see our father, because there are conversations that don't work over the phone, and this was one of them. He was in the garage when I pulled up, same as always, working on something that didn't strictly need working on, a habit he's kept since retiring, the way some men keep a second job just to have somewhere for their hands to go. He didn't ask me what happened. He just handed me a rag and pointed at a bolt he wanted me to hold steady while he worked a wrench around it, and we stood there for a while in comfortable silence before he finally spoke. Your brother tells me your wife had some things to say about you at a dinner party. Something like that, I said. She say it to your face, or around it? Around it. To her friends. One of my own employees happened to be sitting at the table. He grunted, the specific sound he makes when something confirms a suspicion he'd already been carrying. Small world, he said. Or maybe not so small. Maybe you just finally walked into the room at the right moment to hear what's always been said in the other ones. That's what I've been thinking, I admitted. He set the wrench down and wiped his hands on a rag that had clearly given up on ever being clean again. I never had money, Marcus. You know that. Your mother and I did all right, but we never had what you've built, not close. And I'll tell you something I noticed a long time ago, working on machines other men owned for 31 years, people don't respect what a thing is. They respect what they've decided it means. A forklift I fixed for a warehouse boss with a name on the building, he'd shake my hand, thank me kind, and still talk about me to his golf buddies like I was the help. Didn't matter that the machine wouldn't run without me. Some people need you to stay small so the story they tell about themselves still makes sense. So what do I do with that? You already know what you do with it, he said. You did it with every company you built. You don't argue with somebody's story about you. You just stop showing up for the parts of it that need you small. Let them keep the story. You go build the next thing. He picked the wrench back up. Now hold this bolt steady, you're letting it slip. That conversation, more than anything Renata or Dean said in the weeks that followed, was the one that actually settled something in me. Not because it told me what decision to make, I'd already more or less made it by then, but because it reminded me that the impulse to prove Elena wrong, to make her watch me win, wasn't actually the point. The point was simply to stop showing up for a story that had never been true. I hung up and called my attorney, a woman named Renata Voss who has handled every contract, every acquisition, and, as it turned out, was about to handle the dissolution of my marriage. Renata doesn't do sympathy. She does strategy, which is exactly what I needed. I'm not filing today, I told her. I want information first. I want to understand the shape of what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions I can't walk back. What kind of information? I want to know if this was one bad night, or a pattern, I said. And I want it done cleanly. No investigators following her around a grocery store. I'm not interested in melodrama. I want to understand my own life. Renata has known me for 9 years, since the very first contract dispute that nearly sank the company in its second year of existence, and she's one of maybe 4 people alive who's watched me make a hard decision from the inside instead of just hearing about it after the fact. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she said something that stuck with me through the rest of that week. Marcus, I've watched you structure 100 deals where the other side tried to make you think you were desperate, so you take worse terms than the situation actually called for. Don't do that to yourself here. You're not desperate. You don't need to rush a decision just because you're hurting. Take the time. Get the facts. The facts, in my experience, are almost always kinder to people who've actually built something than the story their opponent's been telling about them. You think of this as an opponent situation? I think of every high-stakes decision as a negotiation with incomplete information, she said, whether it's a marriage or an acquisition. The rules for getting clarity are the same either way. Slow down, gather what's true, and don't let anyone's tone convince you the facts are worse than they are, or better than they are. Renata told me she'd have some preliminary paperwork drafted regardless, just so it exists, in case you need it fast, which is the kind of pragmatic caution I've built my entire career on, and I told her to go ahead. I should also tell you about the conversation I had with Talia that same week, separate from the one about Priya's file. Because it matters to how carefully I tried to handle all of this. I sat Talia down in my office on the Monday after the dinner and told her, in broad strokes, what had happened, not the specifics of manage the seams, which hadn't happened yet at that point, but the basic shape of it. My wife had made a disparaging comment about me at a dinner party, and one of our employees had unknowingly been in the room for it. I need you to know this happened, I told her, because I'm about to ask you to pull a personnel file, and I don't want you wondering later whether I had some hidden motive. Priya Anand's promotion review, I want it handled exactly the way it would have been handled if none of this ever happened. If anything, hold it to a higher bar, not a lower one, so nobody, including her, ever has reason to wonder. Talia looked at me for a long moment, the look she gets when she's deciding how much to say. For what it's worth, she finally said, I already had her review sitting on my desk before any of this. She's one of the best analysts we've hired in the last 3 years. If you'd told me to fast-track her because of some personal situation, I'd have pushed back. Since you're telling me to hold her to a higher bar instead, I'll tell you plainly, she'll clear it. She's that good. She did clear it, 6 weeks later, exactly as Talia predicted, on the strength of a body of work that had nothing to do with any of the rest of this story. Monday morning, I went into the office earlier than usual. I asked my COO, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Talia Brennan who has been with me for 7 years, to pull Priya Anand's full file. Not to punish her, I made that explicit, but because I needed to understand the actual shape of her role, her performance, her standing, before I did anything that might affect her professionally without meaning to. Talia, to her credit, didn't ask why. She's learned that when I ask for something specific and quiet, there's usually a reason that will become clear later, or won't need to become clear at all. Priya's file told me what I'd already guessed from the dinner table, she was good. Genuinely good. Her freight optimization models had saved one of our retail clients an estimated $380,000 annually. She'd been flagged for a promotion to team lead, a decision that had been sitting on Talia's desk for review before any of this happened. I made a note, mentally, that whatever else came out of that week, Priya's promotion review was going to move forward on its own merits, untouched by the mess it had accidentally walked into. Then I asked Talia to set up a short, private meeting with Priya, not in the Bellevue office where her colleagues might notice, but at a coffee shop near the waterfront, away from anything that would feel like a summons. Priya arrived looking like she hadn't slept much either. She sat down across from me with the posture of someone bracing for bad news. I want to be very clear before you say anything, I told her. You are not in any trouble. Nothing that happened Friday night reflects on you professionally, and nothing about your job is going to change because of it, except possibly for the better, and that decision was already in motion before Friday, for reasons that have nothing to do with my wife. She let out a breath I hadn't realized she was holding. I've been sick about it all weekend, she said. I keep replaying it. I laughed at some of what she said. Not the worst parts, but I was there, and I didn't say anything, and now I find out that you're the person who owns the whole company, and I feel like I need to explain myself, even though I know that's not really what this is about. It's not, I said. But since you brought it up, how long has Elena been part of your friend group? About a year, she said. We met at a spin class near my apartment. Honestly, she was really warm at first. Funny, generous, always inviting me to things. It took me a while to notice the pattern. What pattern? Priya hesitated, the hesitation of someone deciding whether loyalty to a near stranger's privacy outweighs honesty to the man sitting across from her, who happened to sign her paycheck. She talks about you a lot, she finally said. More than I think she realizes. And it's always in this tone. Like she's apologizing for you before anyone even asks. I remember one time, maybe 4 months ago, someone at brunch asked what you did, and Elena said something like, "Oh, he has some sort of trucking thing, it's very blue collar, but he's sweet about it." I remember thinking that was a strange way to describe running a company, but I didn't know enough to question it. I do freight and logistics analytics for a living, and even I didn't clock that trucking thing might be a $60 million operation. Every sentence she said was another data point landing exactly where I expected it to land, and yet each one still hit like new information. The way a hairline crack you already know about still surprises you every time you find where it spread. Has she ever mentioned me by name? My last name, specifically, in a context where you'd have connected it to the company? Never, Priya said. Not once. I promise you, if I'd known, I would never have. I mean, I work under people who report to people who report to you. It would have been the first thing I clocked. I believed her completely, and I told her so, and I also told her, plainly, that her promotion review was moving forward, unrelated to any of this, on the strength of her actual work, and that I'd appreciate if this conversation stayed between us, not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't want her caught in the middle of a marriage that wasn't hers to carry. She thanked me, visibly relieved, and as she was gathering her things to leave, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "the way you talked about the retail contract at dinner, the $4 million one, I actually worked on part of the freight modeling for that account. I didn't say anything Friday because I didn't want to make it weirder than it already was. But it was a good deal. You should be proud of it." I saw Priya again about 3 weeks later, this time in an entirely ordinary work context. A quarterly review meeting in the Bellevue office where Talia was walking the broader operations team through Q1 numbers. Priya presented her section of the freight optimization data herself, confidently, clearly, fielding a hard question from one of our newer account managers about scalability without missing a beat. I sat near the back of the room, mostly quiet, the way I try to be in meetings that aren't mine to run, and I watched a woman who 2 months earlier had been sitting frozen at my dinner table, mortified, now standing at the front of a conference room owning her work completely. Afterward, as people filed out, she caught my eye and gave a small, genuine smile, the kind that had nothing to do with the dinner at all anymore. It had become, by then, just a strange story from a while back, the way most hard things eventually do. Talia told me later that week that Priya's transition into the team lead role had gone smoother than almost any promotion she could remember in 7 years of managing people. "She's sharp, and more importantly, she doesn't posture," Talia said. "Doesn't need people to think she's more important than she is. Just does the work and lets the work speak." I told Talia that was, without question, the highest compliment either of us could pay anyone, and I meant it more than she probably realized in the moment. That, more than anything Renata or Dean or my father would say to me over the following weeks, was the moment the whole night recalibrated in my mind. My own employee, sitting in my own dining room, had more genuine respect for the work I'd built than my own wife did, and she'd figured that out in real time, on the spot, the second she understood who she was actually sitting across from. I spent the next 10 days doing something I want to describe honestly, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand most. I didn't hire investigators. I didn't go digging through Elena's phone. What I did was simpler, and in some ways more damning. I started paying attention, actively, the way you pay attention to a contract you're about to sign instead of skimming it because you trust the other party. I went to 2 dinners with Elena and her friends over that stretch, both of which I would normally have found some excuse to skip, and I just listened. At the first one, at Caroline's house in Laurelhurst, Elena described my company, unprompted, as Marcus's little operation, in a conversation about someone else's husband's promotion to managing director at a bank. At the second, a birthday dinner for Bitsy at a restaurant downtown, when another guest, a woman I didn't know, married to a venture capitalist, asked what I did, Elena answered for me before I could open my mouth. "He does logistics consulting, sort of blue-collar adjacent, but he's been very successful for what it is." Very successful for what it is. I turned that phrase over in my head the entire drive home. I also, during that stretch, quietly reviewed 9 years of our joint finances with a forensic accountant Renata recommended, not because I suspected theft, Elena had never worked with the company's money directly, and I'd always kept business and personal accounts cleanly separated, a habit my father drilled into me before I ever incorporated anything, but because I wanted a complete, honest picture of where money had gone, what had been spent on what, and whether there was anything in that picture that would matter later. There wasn't anything scandalous. Elena hadn't been unfaithful, as far as anyone could determine, hadn't been secretly draining accounts, hadn't done anything that would read, in a courtroom, as misconduct. What I found instead was almost more painful in its ordinariness. 9 years of a woman quietly, consistently, describing her own life, the house in Madison Park, the vacations, the private school fund we'd started for children we hadn't had yet, to her friends in language that diminished the man who'd built all of it, because admitting how much I'd actually built apparently complicated a social identity she'd rather keep simple. There was a third dinner during that stretch that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the one that finally closed the case for me, the way a final piece of due diligence closes out an acquisition you already suspected was a good deal but hadn't yet proven on paper. It happened on a Thursday, at Bitsy's place in Medina, a lakefront house with a boat lift and a wine cellar her husband liked to show off to anyone who'd stand still long enough. Elena hadn't invited me, this wasn't one of our dinners, it was a girls' night, but she'd mentioned it casually that morning, and something told me to ask if I could stop by afterward to pick her up instead of her taking a car service, the kind of small, ordinary gesture that gave me a legitimate reason to be standing in that house's foyer around 9:30 without it looking like anything other than a husband being thoughtful. I arrived a few minutes early. The front door was propped open for airflow, some kind of dinner party etiquette among that crowd I never fully understood, and I could hear voices clearly from the entryway before anyone realized I was there. Caroline's voice, first, mid-sentence, and honestly, I don't know how you do it, being married to someone so different from what you grew up around. It must be like living two separate lives. Then Bitsy, I think it's sweet, in its way. Very self-made man. Very bootstraps. A little laugh in her voice that made the compliment sound like the opposite of one. And then Elena, and this is the part one want to get exactly right, because I've replayed it enough times that I could recite it verbatim if I had to. Honestly, some days I forget he wasn't born into any of this. He's gotten so good at playing the part. But then something happens, he'll say something, or wear something, or I'll catch him doing the thing where he still checks the price of things out of habit even though it genuinely doesn't matter anymore, and I remember, oh right, this is a guy who grew up 2 blocks from a scrapyard. It's not a bad thing. I just have to manage it sometimes, is all. Manage the seams. Manage the seams. I stood in that foyer for a long moment with my hand still on the open door, and I want to tell you honestly that this hurt worse than the word nobody had, 6 weeks earlier at my own dinner table, because this wasn't performance for an audience I hadn't expected to include an employee of mine. This was Elena, unguarded, among the people she trusted most, describing me the way you'd describe a piece of furniture you'd reupholstered to hide the wear underneath. Something she managed. Something with seams she had to keep smoothing down so the room wouldn't notice what was underneath. I didn't walk in and confront the table. I want to be honest about that instinct, because I had it. For about 4 seconds, I genuinely considered walking into that dining room and asking Caroline and Bitsy, calmly, whether they'd like to see the seams on my most recent tax return. But I've spent 20 years training myself out of the reactive move, and that training held even then, even with my chest tight and my jaw locked. I stepped back outside, waited on the porch for another 10 minutes, and then rang the doorbell properly, like a man who'd just arrived. Elena came out a few minutes later, warm, a little flushed from wine, kissed me on the cheek in the driveway, told me she'd had a lovely night. I said that was good. I didn't say anything else the entire drive home. She asked, once, if I was tired. I told her I was. That was true, though not in the way she meant it. On the 11th day, I asked Elena to sit down with me at the dining room table, the same table, on a Tuesday evening when the house was quiet. I need to tell you what I've been doing the last week and a half, I said, because I don't want to blindside you with a decision you don't understand. I laid it out for her plainly. The conversations I'd overheard. The phrase very successful for what it is. The night at Bitsy's, standing in the foyer, hearing her tell Caroline and Bitsy that she had to manage the seams on a man who'd grown up 2 blocks from a scrapyard. The consistent pattern, across nearly a year of her friendship with Priya and years before that with Caroline and Bitsy, of describing me in terms designed to make me smaller, softer, less threatening to a social hierarchy she seemed desperate to still belong to, even at my expense. When I repeated the phrase "manage the seams" back to her, something happened to Elena's face I hadn't seen before in 9 years of marriage. Not embarrassment exactly. Recognition. The specific look of someone hearing their own private language spoken back to them by someone they never meant to let hear it. "You were at the door," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I was at the door," I confirmed. "I didn't come in. I didn't want to make a scene in Bitsy's foyer. But I heard enough." She put her face in her hands for a moment, and when she looked back up, there wasn't any of the deflection I'd braced for. "No, it was a joke. No, you're being dramatic. Just something quieter and more tired." "I hear it," she said. "When you say it back to me like that, I hear exactly how it sounds. I don't have a version of this where I explain it and it sounds okay. I'm not accusing you of anything you did in secret," I told her. "That's actually what makes this harder to explain to people who ask. You didn't cheat on me. You didn't steal from me. You just, for 9 years, apparently, you've been quietly telling the story of our life in a way that erases the size of what I actually built, because the true size of it doesn't fit the world you want to belong to." And the night that finally became visible to me happened to be a night when one of my own employees was sitting in the room to hear it. Elena's eyes filled, and I want to be fair here, I don't think her tears were performance. I think, for the first time in a long while, she was actually looking at the shape of what she'd been doing, rather than the shape of how it felt from the inside. "I don't know why I do it," she said quietly. I think some part of me never stopped feeling like the poor relation in my own family, growing up. My parents had a name, but not real money, not compared to the people we socialized with in Greenwich. And then I married someone who built real money, actual money, and somehow it still didn't feel like enough to hand to people, because it didn't come with the right kind of story attached. It didn't come from a name they already knew. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in longer than I can remember," I told her. "But Elena, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry that you grew up feeling like the poor relation. I'm not even angry, entirely, about Friday night. What I can't get past is 9 years. 9 years of watching you shrink the thing I'm proudest of, in front of people whose respect apparently mattered more to you than mine." "So what does that mean?" she asked. "What do you want to do?" "I want a separation," I said. "I've already started the paperwork. I'm not doing it out of spite, and I'm not doing it to punish you in front of anyone. I'm doing it because I don't think I can keep building a life with someone who's spent this long describing that life as something smaller than it is." She didn't fight me on it, not that night, not in the way I half expected. I think, somewhere underneath the shock, she already knew the math had been done long before I said it out loud. The separation was, by design, quiet. No dramatic public unraveling, no scenes at restaurants, nothing for Caroline and Bitsy to whisper about over the next round of brunches, though I have no doubt they whispered about it anyway. Renata handled the filing cleanly. Washington is a no-fault state, which made the legal mechanics simpler than the emotional ones. There was one moment during the settlement negotiations I want to tell you about, because it's the closest thing to a confrontation this story actually has, and it didn't happen with Elena at all. It happened with her attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Preston Holloway who Elena's father had apparently insisted on hiring, flown in for 2 of the mediation sessions from a firm in Connecticut that, I later found out, did a fair amount of work for Caroline's husband's family. Holloway opened the second session by suggesting, with the kind of practiced condescension I'd sat across from plenty of times in business, that given the modest and recent nature of my company's growth, a more conservative view of its valuation might be appropriate for settlement purposes, the implication being that Whitfield Logistics Group was some fragile, unproven thing that might not survive the year, rather than a 12-year-old company with 3 offices and audited financials going. Back a decade. Renata didn't even look up from her folder. She slid across the table a bound copy of our last 3 years of audited statements, our client contract list including 2 Fortune 500 accounts, and a 1-page summary showing that the company's 5-year growth trajectory had outpaced every comparable regional firm in the Pacific Northwest by a wide margin. Modest and recent, she said, isn't really the phrase I'd reach for. But you're welcome to argue it in front of a judge if you'd like a public record of trying. Holloway didn't argue it in front of a judge. The house stayed mine, cleanly, as separate property acquired before the marriage. I offered Elena a settlement anyway, more generous than Renata or my accountant thought strictly necessary, because I wasn't interested in winning a war, only in closing a chapter with some dignity intact on both sides, dignity Elena's own father's chosen attorney had apparently tried to strip from me on his way out the door. Elena, notably, hadn't asked Holloway to make that argument, and told me so afterward, in one of the last conversations we had before the paperwork was finalized. That wasn't me, she said. That was my father's idea of helping. I told him I didn't want it handled that way. I don't think he heard me. It was, in its own strange way, one of the more honest things she said to me during the entire process, and it didn't change the outcome, but it did change, slightly, how I remembered her afterward. She took a position, a few months later, doing event production again, the work she'd left behind years earlier, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd found it, unexpectedly, more satisfying than the world of galas and boards she'd spent years trying to fully belong to. Priya's promotion to team lead went through 6 weeks after that dinner, entirely on the strength of her freight optimization work, a decision Talia had already been building the case for months before any of us knew each other's names outside a spreadsheet. I want to be clear about that timeline, because I know how this could look from the outside, like I promoted an employee because of some tangled personal entanglement, and that's not what happened. If anything, I was more careful with her file than I would have been with anyone else's, precisely because I didn't want even the appearance of favoritism clouding a decision she'd earned honestly. I ran into Caroline about 2 months after the divorce, at an industry mixer of all places. Her husband's wealth office was sponsoring a table at a downtown business awards dinner, and Whitfield Logistics Group had, coincidentally, been nominated in the mid-market growth category that year. She spotted me across the room during the cocktail hour and had the good sense to look uncomfortable about it, which I respected more than I expected to. "Marcus," she said. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "We're up for an award," I said. "Mid-market growth. Should know by the end of the night whether we won it." Something shifted in her face, a small recalibration, the same one I'd watched happen to Priya at my dinner table months earlier, though slower this time, more reluctant. "I didn't realize the company was, I knew you did well, obviously, but I didn't realize you were the kind of company that gets nominated for things like this." "We've been nominated for it the last 3 years running," I said. "Won it once, in 2022. I didn't say it unkindly. I didn't need to. The fact simply sat there in the space between us, doing the work on its own. We ended up back at our table, and about 40 minutes later, the MC called Whitfield Logistics Group as the winner in our category. I gave a short acceptance speech, thanked Talia, thanked the team, mentioned Priya's freight optimization work by name because she deserved to hear her name said out loud in a room like that, and when I sat back down, I noticed Caroline watching from 3 tables away with an expression that had nothing performative left in it at all. Just plain, uncomplicated surprise, the look of someone recalculating a person they'd spent years filing under a category that had never actually been true. I heard, through the same mutual acquaintance grapevine that carries most information in that world, that Caroline mentioned the awards dinner to Bitsy afterward, and that the story of Marcus's little operation quietly stopped being told at brunches after that. I can't verify that directly. I wasn't in the room. But I like to think it's true, and more importantly, I noticed that I no longer needed it to be true in order to feel settled about who I am and what I've built. That, more than the award itself, felt like the actual prize. I ran into Elena once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, at a farmer's market near Pike Place on a Saturday morning. She looked well, genuinely well, the specific kind of well that comes from someone no longer performing a version of themselves for an audience. We talked for a few minutes, easily, without the charge I'd expected. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about that dinner. About the word I used." "I know," I said. "I don't think I ever really believed it," she said. "I think I believed the room believed it, or that I needed the room to believe it, and it just came out that way." "That's not an excuse." "I know it's not. I just wanted you to know I've thought about it more than I think you'd expect." "I appreciate you saying that," I told her, and I meant it, the same way I meant it when I told Priya she had nothing to apologize for. Some conversations don't need an ending with a winner in it. They just need honesty, finally, arriving later than it should have. We wished each other well. I bought a bag of peaches and drove home to the house in Madison Park, which felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely mine, not because Elena's name was off the deed, it had never been on it, but because the story of what that house represented finally belonged only to the man who'd actually built it. There's one more scene I want to tell you about, because it happened almost by accident, and it ended up meaning more to me than the awards dinner or the farmer's market or any of the moments I'd half expected to feel like closure. About 5 months after the divorce was finalized, I flew to Chicago for a client dinner with the retail chain whose $4 million contract had come up, unknowingly, at that very first dinner with Elena's friends. The client's VP of supply chain, a woman named Denise Okafor, had worked her way up from a warehouse floor in Gary, Indiana, over 22 years, the kind of career arc that doesn't get talked about much at galas in Greenwich or Medina, but that I recognized instantly, because it rhymed with my own. We were seated at a steakhouse downtown with 2 of her directors and one of my account managers, and somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, the conversation drifted, the way it does among people who've actually built things, into stories about where we'd all started. Denise told a story about her first year on the warehouse floor, learning to read a shipping manifest by lamplight because the overhead fixtures in that section of the building had never worked right, and how a supervisor had once told her, not unkindly, that she was sharp for someone who didn't finish her associate's degree, a comment she said she'd carried for years, the way you carry a stone in your shoe you've stopped noticing but that's still shaping how you walk. I told her, in turn, about the scrapyard 2 blocks from my childhood house, about stocking shelves at 3 a.m. and learning supply chains from pallets instead of textbooks, about a dinner table not that many months earlier where my own wife had called me a nobody in front of her friends. Denise didn't flinch at that story the way people in Elena's circle might have, with polite discomfort, unsure where to look. She just nodded, slow and knowing, and said, "People who've never had to build anything always think the building is the easy part. It's not. The easy part is inheriting something and calling it your own personality." Her directors laughed, not unkindly, and one of them raised a glass, and for the rest of that dinner nobody at the table needed to explain or justify or soften the size of what any of us had actually done with our lives. It was, without any of us naming it directly, the exact opposite of that April night in Madison Park, a table full of people who respected the work because they understood, from the inside, exactly what the work had cost. I flew home the next morning thinking about the difference between those 2 tables. Not the money at either one. Denise's directors weren't wealthy in the way Caroline's husband was wealthy, and neither, honestly, was I when you measured it against the oldest names in Greenwich. The difference was simpler than money. At one table, what you'd built determined how the room saw you. At the other table, what your last name already meant determined how the room saw you, and what you'd actually built was, at best, an interesting footnote, something to be managed, smoothed over, described in softer language so it wouldn't disturb the shape of a story that had already been decided before you sat down. I understood, somewhere over Montana at 31,000 feet, that I would rather spend the rest of my life eating steak with people like Denise Okafor than sitting through one more dinner where my own life needed translating into a language more comfortable for someone else's insecurity. Here's what I've learned in the months since that Friday night, and I think it's worth saying plainly, because I know some of you listening have sat at a table like that one, have heard someone you love describe your life in language too small for what you actually built. It is possible to love someone and still recognize that the story they're telling about you isn't the truth. It is possible to respond to a wound like that without shouting, without smashing anything, without needing an audience of your own to witness your comeback. The most powerful move I made in this entire story wasn't confronting Elena at the table, and it wasn't the divorce filing, and it definitely wasn't some dramatic reveal. It was simply refusing, from that point forward, to let anyone describe what I've built as smaller than it is, starting with myself. Whitfield Logistics Group opened a third office in Portland 2 months ago. We're on track to clear $74 million in revenue this year. Priya Anand now leads a team of 6 analysts and, last I checked, has become genuinely close friends with Talia, which tells you something about the kind of person she actually is once you take the noise of that one strange dinner out of the picture. My father still refuses to replace his truck. My brother still checks in every week, usually with some version of the same question, "You doing all right?" And lately, for the first time in a long while, I get to answer honestly that yes, I am. I stood in the new Portland office on the day we signed the lease, an empty floor with nothing in it yet but sunlight coming in through windows that hadn't been cleaned since the last tenant moved out, and I thought about the spare bedroom in Ballard where all of this actually started, the cheap desk, the refurbished laptop, the $14,000 that felt, at the time, like both everything I had and not nearly enough. Nobody was there to see that room fill up with something real, year after year, except me. Nobody needed to be. That was always the part Elena never quite understood, standing at those dinner tables trying to explain me in language small enough for the room. The building of it was never something that needed her permission, or Caroline's, or Bitsy's, or anyone's. It just needed to keep happening, quietly, one contract and one hire and one empty floor at a time, whether or not anyone in the room that night was willing to call it what it actually was. I think about that night less than you'd expect. But when I do think about it, I don't think about the word nobody. I think about the silence right after it, the specific quality of a room realizing it's been caught believing something untrue about a person who was sitting right there the whole time. And I think about how quickly the truth rearranges a room, once somebody finally says it out loud. I also think, sometimes, about how easily this whole story could have stayed buried. If Priya hadn't been at that particular dinner. If I'd come home 20 minutes later, missed the exchange entirely, walked in after the conversation had already moved on to Bitsy's lake house contractor. There's a version of my life, running parallel to this one somewhere, where I never find out what manage the seams means, where I keep showing up at galas and brunches as the sweet, blue-collar adjacent husband who's very successful for what it is, where I spend another 5, 10, 15 years quietly shrinking myself to fit a story that was never true, because I never happened to be standing in the right doorway at the right moment to hear it said out loud. That thought unsettles me more than anything that actually happened that Friday night. Not the humiliation. The math of how close I came to never knowing. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I think most people who are underestimated by someone close to them don't get the clean, almost cinematic reveal I got, an employee at the table, a name that connects instantly, a moment so specific it practically demands a decision. Most people find out slowly, in fragments, in comments dropped at family gatherings, in the particular way a parent introduces them at a reunion, in a partner who never quite brags about them the way they brag about other people's partners. If that's you, I hope this story gives you permission to trust the fragments. You don't need a dinner table reveal to know when someone has been quietly deciding you're smaller than you are. You already know. You've probably known for longer than you've let yourself admit. What I'd want you to take from this, more than the specifics of Elena or Priya or Whitfield Logistics Group, is this: the size of what you've built doesn't change based on who's willing to say it out loud. Elena's version of me, sweet, blue-collar adjacent, a nobody with an office and his name on the door, was never true, not for one single day of our marriage, regardless of whether she said it at a dinner table or kept it to herself for another decade. The company existed either way. The 340 employees existed either way. The 12 years of 5 a.m. mornings and skipped vacations and a spare bedroom in Ballard with $14,000 and a used laptop existed either way. Her willingness to see it clearly was never actually a condition of it being real. It just felt that way, for longer than it should have, because she was the person I'd chosen to build a life beside. That's the part one thing people miss most when they hear a story like this and assume it's really about revenge: the company award, the steakhouse dinner with Denise Okafor, Caroline's face going slack at the award ceremony. None of that is what actually fixed anything. Those moments were nice. I won't pretend they weren't satisfying in a small, human way. But the actual repair happened earlier and quieter than any of that, in a garage in Tacoma, holding a bolt steady while my father told me that some people need you to stay small so their own story still makes sense, and that the answer isn't to argue with their story. It's to stop showing up for it. I've stopped showing up for it. I don't know what Elena tells people now, if anyone asks about her ex-husband at some dinner in Medina or Laurelhurst. I've genuinely stopped needing to know. What I know instead is what I'm building this year, and the year after that, and the fact that when Priya stood up in that quarterly review and walked a room full of colleagues through freight optimization numbers she'd built herself, nobody in that room needed to soften the size of what she'd done to make it comfortable for anyone else's insecurity. That's the room I want to keep building. That's the only room that was ever actually worth belonging to. Thanks for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, let me know in the comments. I read every one. And if you've got a story of your own about being underestimated by the people closest to you, about a moment when you finally heard, out loud, exactly what someone had privately decided about you, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember, the people who call you a nobody are usually the ones who never had to build anything themselves. Don't argue with their story. Just stop showing up for it, and go build the next thing.